In the late 1830s, Louisiana was a land of sharp contrasts, where beauty and brutality existed side by side. Along the Mississippi River, grand plantation houses stood proudly, surrounded by oak trees draped in Spanish moss. These homes represented wealth, power, and tradition. Inside them were polished floors, imported furniture, and families who believed the system supporting their lives was natural and permanent. Yet just beyond these elegant facades lay another world entirely, the quarters where enslaved people lived, worked, suffered, and survived. It was in this divided world that a quiet and terrifying mystery began to unfold, one that would stretch across 7 years and expose the darkest truths of a system built on human bondage. In 1837, no one yet understood what was happening. There was no grand theory, no whispered accusation spoken aloud. There was only a single birth that did not make sense. At first, it was treated as an oddity, something uncomfortable but easier to ignore than to question. Plantation society depended on silence. Asking the wrong questions could threaten property, reputations, and the fragile order that kept everything running. But this one birth planted a seed of doubt, and once that seed took root, it would grow into something impossible to control. Louisiana's plantation economy, especially in the sugar-producing parishes north of New Orleans, was among the harshest in the American South. Sugar cultivation demanded extreme labor under brutal conditions. During the grinding season, which lasted from October through December, enslaved people worked almost non-stop. Days blurred into nights as sugarcane was cut, hauled, crushed, boiled, and packed. The machinery was unforgiving. Exhaustion caused accidents, and accidents often meant death. Plantation owners knew this and accepted it as part of doing business. Human lives were measured against profit margins, recorded in ledgers like broken tools or lost livestock. Because plantations along the Mississippi River sat close together, information traveled quickly. News moved by riverboats, by traders, and through the informal but powerful communication networks among enslaved people. A birth on one plantation was known on another within hours. This closeness would later make the pattern impossible to deny, but in the beginning it only amplified confusion. The first recorded birth that raised serious concern took place in March of 1837 at Bellamont Plantation, a medium-sized sugar operation owned by the Dutchamp family. Bellamont was typical of the region. The main house stood elevated on brick pillars to protect it from flooding, while behind it lay the sugar works and, further back, the enslaved quarters. The quarters were cramped cabins where multiple families lived together with no privacy and little comfort. The life there was about endurance, not living. The plantation was overseen by Vincent Habert, a man known for his careful record-keeping and disciplined management. Unlike many overseers, he relied more on organization than open cruelty, though he still enforced a violent system. Habert knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name. He tracked their work, their health, and their family pairings, all of which were carefully documented. This knowledge gave him control, and it also placed him in a position to notice when something was wrong. On March 14, 1837, an enslaved woman named Marie gave birth just before dawn. Marie was 23 years old, strong and quiet. She had been born on Bellamont and had known no other life. Years earlier, she had watched her own mother die in a sugar mill accident, an event that left her withdrawn and emotionally guarded. Marie had already given birth to one child, a boy who looked exactly as expected, dark-skinned, dark-eyed, and healthy. There was nothing unusual about her pregnancy this time either. The birth was attended by Josephine, an elderly enslaved midwife with decades of experience. Josephine had seen every possible outcome of childbirth, from joy to tragedy. She had learned to show little emotion, to do her work and move on. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and held her up to the lamplight, something inside her shifted. The baby had pale skin, hair so blonde it seemed almost white, and bright blue eyes. These were not features that could be easily explained away. This was not a case of slightly lighter skin or loosely curled hair. The child looked fully European. Her facial structure, hair texture, and eye color did not resemble Marie, the man recorded as her partner, or anyone else in the quarters. Josephine felt fear, real fear, not superstition, but the understanding that this child's existence would bring consequences. Marie herself said very little when she saw her daughter. She simply stared, her exhaustion replaced by something heavier. She held the baby, her hands shaking, tears quietly falling. When asked if the child resembled anyone she knew, Marie remained silent. That silence spoke louder than any answer could. When Marie's partner, Thomas, arrived later that morning, his reaction was immediate and harsh. One look at the child was enough. He refused to accept her as his own and demanded explanations Marie could not give. She insisted she had been with no one else. The argument ended with Thomas walking away, leaving Marie alone with a child who would forever change her life. By midday, everyone on Belmont knew. By evening, neighboring plantations knew too. Whispers spread. Some spoke of curses or divine punishment. Others sensed something darker but dared not name it. When Vincent Habert was called to report the matter to Monsieur Duchamp, the plantation owner, the response was firm and fearful. The birth was to be recorded. Thomas would remain the father of record. There would be no discussion, no investigation, no scandal. Yet Habert knew what he had seen, and for the first time he opened a private journal separate from official records. In it, he carefully described the birth, the child's appearance, and Marie's testimony. He dated the entry and closed the book, unaware that this single act would begin a record of events that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The child was named Claire, and though no one realized it yet, her birth marked the beginning of a pattern that Louisiana would struggle and ultimately fail to confront. After Claire's birth, life on Belmont Plantation was supposed to return to normal, but nothing truly did. Even when people stopped talking openly, the unease remained. Claire's appearance made silence impossible. As she grew from a newborn into an infant, her difference became more visible with each passing month. Her hair stayed light and soft, her eyes remained an unnatural blue for a child born in the quarters, and her skin burned quickly under the Louisiana sun. Every glance at her reminded the enslaved community of something that could not be explained and could not be safely questioned. Marie tried to settle into motherhood, but the joy she should have felt was mixed with confusion, fear, and a deep, quiet grief. Claire was her child, yet every time Marie looked at her, she was forced to remember the night she could not understand and could not speak about. Thomas never accepted Claire. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin, and eventually asked to be moved to a different work crew. The small family unit that the plantation had forced into existence was destroyed, leaving Marie to raise a child alone in a world that offered her no protection. Vincent Habert watched all of this closely. As overseer, it was his duty to monitor productivity, discipline, and order, but Claire's presence disturbed him in ways he could not easily define. He had seen mixed heritage children before. Louisiana was full of them, and their existence, though uncomfortable, was not unusual. But this was different. Claire did not resemble a child of mixed ancestry. She looked entirely European, and that fact challenged everything Habert thought he understood. Though he followed Monsieur Duchamp's orders and kept the official records clean and unquestioned, he continued writing in his private journal. He noted Claire's development, the reactions of those around her, and the growing tension within the quarters. At first, he told himself it was only caution, that careful men recorded unusual events, but deep down he feared this birth was not an isolated incident. That fear was confirmed the following year. In May of 1838, word reached Belmont of another strange birth, this time at Riverside Plantation, several miles upriver. Riverside was larger and more tightly controlled than Belmont, known for its harsh discipline and constant fear. The mother was a young enslaved woman named Deline, who worked in the main house laundry. Like Marie, she insisted she had been with no one except the man assigned to her. Like Thomas, that man refused to accept the child. And like Claire, the baby had blonde hair, blue eyes, and pale skin. When Habert heard the details, he felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Two births on two different plantations could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. News of the second child spread quickly through the enslaved community. Women whispered to one another late at night, sharing fears they could never voice during the day. Some spoke of spirits or punishment, but others understood the danger in more practical terms. Whatever was happening, it involved power, access, and silence. The fact that both mothers had recently worked near the main houses did not go unnoticed. The main house was a place of authority, where enslaved women had little control and even less safety. It was a place where refusal was not an option. Habert began to listen more carefully. He asked traders casual questions, pretending curiosity rather than concern. He paid attention to gossip carried along the river. Slowly, more stories emerged. In late 1838, another child was born at Oakmont Plantation, then another at St. Clair Plantation in early 1839. Each time, the details were disturbingly similar. A dark-skinned mother, a recorded father who matched her appearance, and a child who looked nothing like either of them. Each time, the man listed as the father rejected the child, and the woman withdrew into silence. By the time a fifth child was born at Magnolia Grove later that year, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Habert began organizing his notes more carefully. He listed dates, locations, names of mothers, and work assignments. He marked the plantations on a rough map and noticed how closely they clustered along the Mississippi River. He also noticed something else, something that took longer to recognize. A name appeared again and again in the background of each case. Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was a respected physician who traveled between plantations, treating both planter families and enslaved people when it was considered economically worthwhile. He was known for his skill, his calm demeanor, and his discretion. Planters trusted him, and that trust gave him access. When Habert reviewed his notes, the timing disturbed him deeply. In every case, Levine had been present on the plantation a few months before the mother became pregnant. Sometimes he had stayed overnight as a guest. Sometimes he had been called to treat illness or injury. Sometimes he had attended social gatherings. Always, he had legitimate reasons to be there. Always, he had access to the main house and the people who worked within it. The realization made Habert physically uneasy. Suspicion alone was dangerous, but the pattern was too precise to dismiss. Despite this, Habert understood the limits of his position. Accusing a respected white doctor without proof would destroy his own life and achieve nothing for the women involved. Enslaved women had no legal standing. Even if they spoke, their words would carry no weight. Worse, they would be punished for speaking at all. Habert tried carefully to speak with some of the mothers. Each conversation ended the same way. They denied everything beyond what was already written in the records. Their silence was not ignorance, it was survival. As the number of strange births grew, the enslaved women began to change their behavior. Many started refusing assignments to the main house, claiming illness or injury. Others worked more slowly, resisted quietly, or accepted punishment rather than comply. Overseers responded with violence, but the resistance continued. Fear had replaced obedience. Productivity suffered, tensions rose, and plantation owners complained about disorder without understanding its cause. Habert, however, saw it clearly. These women were protecting themselves in the only way available to them. By the end of 1839, 5 children had been born with the same impossible features. What had begun as a single unexplained birth had become a quiet terror shared across plantations and parishes. The truth was still unspoken, still officially denied, but it was no longer hidden. Something was happening in Louisiana's plantation society, something calculated and cruel, and it was only just beginning to reveal its full scale. By the time the fifth child was born, fear had replaced confusion across the plantations. What people once tried to dismiss as coincidence now felt deliberate, as if an unseen hand was moving freely through spaces where no one should have had such access. The enslaved community understood this reality more clearly than anyone else. Women began watching one another closely, sharing quiet warnings, learning which plantations were safest and which were not. They noticed patterns long before the overseers did. The women who gave birth to these pale-haired, blue-eyed children all shared one thing in common. At some point before their pregnancies, they had been called into the main house, often at night, often alone, often under orders they could not refuse. This knowledge spread silently, passed from mouth to ear after long days of labor, carried in looks rather than words, because speaking openly could invite punishment or worse. For the men listed as fathers, the situation brought humiliation and anger. Though they had no legal authority over their own lives, their sense of dignity was deeply wounded. Each impossible child was a public declaration that something had happened to their partners without their consent and beyond their control. Many responded by withdrawing completely. They asked for transfers, avoided shared cabins, and severed emotional ties they had struggled to build under forced conditions. These broken relationships weakened the already fragile bonds within the quarters, leaving women more isolated and vulnerable than before. Plantation owners saw only disorder and declining productivity. They blamed laziness, disobedience, or poor oversight, never the system itself. Vincent Habert found himself caught between duty and conscience. As overseer, he was expected to maintain control, suppress rumors, and keep the plantation running smoothly. Yet each new birth confirmed what he feared. This was not random, and it was not accidental. He expanded his private records, listing each child in careful detail. He recorded dates of conception as closely as possible, noted when women had been assigned to housework, and traced movements between plantations. Slowly, a clear timeline emerged. Every path led back to the same figure, though Habert still hesitated to write the name openly. To do so felt dangerous, even on paper. Eventually, he could no longer ignore it. Dr. Marcus Levine was not merely present near these events. He was consistently positioned in a way that granted him privacy, authority, and unquestioned access. As a physician, his presence raised no suspicion. He entered plantations freely, stayed overnight, and moved between households with respect and trust. He spoke softly, dressed well, and carried himself with calm confidence. Plantation owners viewed him as an asset, someone who protected their investments by keeping both families and valuable enslaved workers alive. No one questioned him, and no one watched him closely. Habert reviewed his memories of Levine with new eyes. He recalled how the doctor often requested quiet spaces, how he sometimes asked for assistance from women working in the main house, how his visits coincided with evenings when enslaved women were separated from the protection of the quarters. None of these details meant anything on their own, but together they formed a picture that made Habert's stomach turn. Still, suspicion was not proof, and without proof, accusation would be suicide. Desperate for guidance, Habert decided to take a risk and speak to someone outside the plantation hierarchy. He requested a private meeting with Judge harm.This, a man known for his reputation as fair-minded within the limits of the law. When they met, Habert presented his records carefully, choosing his words with caution. He showed the map, the dates, the repeated presence of the same doctor. He did not accuse directly. He simply asked whether such a pattern could truly be coincidence. The judge listened in silence, his expression darkening with every detail. When Habert finished, the room fell quiet. Finally, the judge spoke, not with anger but with exhaustion. Even if the suspicions were true, he explained, the law offered no clear path forward. Enslaved women could not testify against a white man. Their word held no legal weight. Without testimony, there could be no case. And even with testimony, the law did not recognize what had been done to them as a crime. Habert felt the weight of that truth settle heavily on his chest. Still, the judge agreed to make discreet inquiries. He promised caution, warning Habert to stop his own investigation immediately. Any uncontrolled spread of rumors could destabilize the region. Habert agreed, though he knew silence would not stop what was already unfolding. Within weeks, the judge's inquiries reached plantation owners who reacted with hostility and fear. They denied everything, insisting the births were natural anomalies. To admit otherwise would mean admitting loss of control, failure of authority, and cracks in a system they depended on. When word returned that the inquiry was officially closed, Habert was not surprised. He locked his notes away but could not forget what he had learned, and as if to mock the decision, the births continued. One plantation after another recorded children with the same pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Each new birth deepened the terror among enslaved women and strengthened the certainty that someone was acting without restraint or consequence. By now, whispers had turned into quiet understanding. People no longer asked who was responsible. They already knew. What they feared was not discovery, but that nothing would ever be done. By the early 1840s, the tension had become impossible to contain. Resistance spread quietly but steadily. Women refused house assignments even under threat. Work slowed, tools broke. Small acts of defiance accumulated into serious disruption. Plantation owners demanded answers, unaware that the very structure they defended was the cause of the chaos. Vincent Habert understood that the truth was no longer something he could carry alone. The pattern was too clear, the suffering too great. And though he knew the risks, he began to share what he knew, carefully at first, with people he trusted. The silence that had protected the powerful for so long was beginning to crack. As the quiet sharing of information spread from overseer to overseer and from plantation to plantation, the truth that had once been unthinkable became openly acknowledged in private circles. Dr. Marcus Levine was no longer just a suspicion. He was the center of the pattern. By 1842, there were more than a dozen children whose existence pointed back to him, living evidence that could not be erased no matter how hard plantation owners tried to deny it. What unsettled people most was not only what Levine had done, but how calmly and systematically it had been done. This was not reckless behavior driven by impulse. It was controlled, planned, and repeated with precision. The realization shook even those who were otherwise comfortable with the brutal logic of slavery. This was something different. This was intention. The pressure eventually reached Levine himself. Whispers reached his ears, not as accusations shouted in the open, but as careful questions and tense silences when he entered rooms. He understood immediately that secrecy was no longer guaranteed. Rather than flee or deny responsibility, Levine chose a path that surprised everyone. He invited the plantation owners most directly affected, along with a judge and several prominent men of the parish, to his home for a private meeting. The invitation was polite and confident, framed as an opportunity to clarify misunderstandings before rumors caused unnecessary damage. Curiosity and unease drew them in. No one quite knew what to expect. When the men gathered in Levine's parlor on a humid September evening, the setting felt disturbingly normal. There was whiskey on the sideboard, cigars laid out neatly, comfortable chairs arranged as though for casual conversation. Levine greeted each guest calmly, his appearance immaculate, his manner relaxed. He showed no fear, no defensiveness. When everyone was seated, he spoke plainly. There was no attempt at evasion. He acknowledged the rumors and then confirmed them without hesitation. He was the father of the children. All of them. The room erupted in shock and outrage, voices overlapping as men demanded explanations and hurled accusations. Levine waited patiently, allowing the anger to burn itself out before continuing. What followed was more horrifying than denial could have been. Levine explained that his actions were deliberate, part of what he described as a scientific experiment. He claimed he was studying heredity and racial traits, attempting to prove that physical characteristics could be controlled and predicted. He spoke of the women not as victims, but as subjects. He spoke of the children not as human beings, but as results. In his view, the experiment had been a success. His genetic contribution, he said, had consistently produced children with European features regardless of the mother's appearance. He presented this as knowledge, something valuable and progressive, something that future generations would appreciate. When confronted with the moral reality of what he had done, Levine did not flinch. He argued that he had broken no law. Under Louisiana law, enslaved women were property, not persons. Property could not refuse. Property could not be violated. His reasoning was cold, precise, and legally correct. This was the moment when many in the room realized the true depth of the horror. The system they relied on for wealth and authority had not merely allowed this to happen, it had protected it. Levine was not an outsider abusing the system. He was using it exactly as designed. The judge present attempted to assert moral authority, condemning Levine's actions as monstrous even if they were technically legal. Plantation owners demanded that Levine leave the region, not out of justice, but out of fear. The scandal threatened reputations, property values, and social stability. Levine accepted their anger calmly. He revealed that he had already made plans to leave Louisiana and continue his work elsewhere, where oversight was weaker and opportunity greater. He spoke of the frontier as if it were an open laboratory. Within weeks, Levine was gone. His house was sold, his practice quietly reassigned, his presence erased as thoroughly as possible. There was no trial, no punishment, no public reckoning. The men involved closed ranks, agreeing without words that silence was preferable to accountability. Officially, nothing had happened, but the damage remained. 13 children lived with faces that carried the truth their society refused to confront. 13 mothers bore the weight of trauma without language, without justice, without acknowledgement, and those who had finally glimpsed the reality of the system could no longer pretend ignorance. The crime had been named privately, but it had no legal name. And because of that, it would leave no official scar, only human ones. After Levine's departure, the plantations tried to return to order, but the illusion of normalcy was impossible to restore. The system moved forward as it always had, yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The children Levine left behind grew older, and with each passing year, their existence became more difficult to ignore. They did not blend into the quarters the way other children did. Their pale skin, light hair, and blue eyes marked them as different from birth, and difference in a world built on rigid hierarchy was dangerous. Some plantation owners saw opportunity rather than tragedy. Children with lighter features were often reassigned to housework, displayed quietly as symbols of refinement, or sold at higher prices under the language of special value. This new layer of exploitation meant that Levine's violation did not end with the mothers. It followed the children into their futures, shaping how they were treated, where they were placed, and what was expected of them. For the mothers, life became an endurance measured in small, silent moments. Some tried desperately to love their children despite the pain attached to their existence. Marie, in particular, clung to Claire, shielding her from cruelty when she could, singing to her softly at night, and trying to separate the child from the memory of what had been done to her. But love did not erase trauma. Every milestone carried a reminder. Other women could not bear the same closeness. They fed and clothed their children out of necessity, but affection felt impossible. The children sensed this distance early, growing up with an unspoken understanding that their presence caused pain. The men who had been listed as fathers were gone. Most had requested transfers or had been reassigned quietly to reduce tension. The families that plantation owners had forcibly constructed were permanently broken. In the quarters, opinions were divided. Some people felt deep sympathy for the mothers, understanding that silence was not consent but survival. Others blamed them, believing they must have participated willingly. These judgments created fractures within the enslaved community itself, further weakening solidarity in a system that already worked hard to divide. Vincent Habert remained at Bellamont for several more years, but the burden of what he knew weighed heavily on him. He saw the children grow. He saw the mothers withdraw. He saw the system continue unchanged, protecting itself with silence and legality. Though he had failed to bring justice, he refused to let the truth disappear entirely. He kept his journals hidden, adding to them when new births occurred, when families were separated, when children were sold away. Each entry was an act of quiet resistance, a refusal to allow the story to vanish. Eventually, the cost became too great. Habert resigned his position and left plantation life behind. He moved to New Orleans, accepting work that paid less but allowed him distance from a system he no longer believed in. Years later, after slavery had ended, he donated his journals to a historical archive. He wrote that they documented crimes that were never crimes under the law, suffering that the legal system refused to see. His hope was not revenge, but memory, that someone someday would read these pages and understand how easily cruelty hides behind legality. The law, unchanged at the time, offered no resolution. The judge who had confronted Levine spent the rest of his career haunted by the case. He searched for legal language that might have named the harm, but the structure of slavery allowed none. The realization that the law itself had been the shield for such acts shook his faith permanently. Others involved chose forgetfulness. Silence was easier. Silence preserved reputations. The children grew up in this silence. Some were sold away before they could understand why their mothers cried when they were taken. Others stayed, growing into adolescents who did not belong fully anywhere. They were too visibly different to disappear, yet too powerless to explain their own existence. Their lives were shaped by a choice made without them, before they were born, by a man who saw them as proof of a theory rather than as people. Long after Levine was gone, his impact remained woven into the lives he had touched. The plantations moved on, profits recovered, records stayed clean. But the damage lingered in quiet glances, in fractured families, in children who learned early that their bodies carried histories no one wanted to acknowledge. What had happened was not remembered as a crime, but it endured as a wound, one that never healed because it had never been named. As years passed and slavery itself finally collapsed under the weight of war and resistance, the children born from Levine's actions entered a world that was legally changed but socially unforgiving. Freedom did not erase the marks carried on their bodies or the questions attached to their faces. These children, now adolescents and young adults, found themselves trapped between worlds. In black communities, they were often viewed with suspicion, their appearance a reminder of violence and imbalance of power that many wished to forget. In white society, they were barred by law, history, and ancestry from belonging. They existed in a narrow space where identity offered no safety and no certainty. Some tried to survive by remaining invisible, keeping their heads down, working quietly, and avoiding attention. Others made a different choice and attempted to pass as white, leaving behind their families, their names, and their histories. For a few, this worked. They disappeared into new towns, married into white families, and raised children who would never know the truth. But this escape came at the cost of permanent separation, silence, and the erasure of their own mother's suffering. For those who remained within black communities, life followed a different but equally difficult path. They built families, labored for wages instead of under whips, and tried to claim dignity in a society that offered little of it. Yet the legacy followed them. Sometimes their own children were born with lighter hair or eyes, reviving old whispers and reopening old wounds. Stories were told in fragments, softened or altered over time until the truth became blurred and uncertain. What remained was a sense of something unspoken, a shadow stretching across generations. Vincent Habert lived long enough to see slavery abolished, but not long enough to believe the world had truly learned from it. When he donated his journals, he did so with the understanding that history often prefers comfort over truth. His records were archived, rarely read, quietly forgotten among thousands of other documents. They existed as proof, but proof requires witnesses willing to look. Without that willingness, even the clearest evidence fades into obscurity. Dr. Marcus Levine, meanwhile, continued his life far from Louisiana. Fragmented records suggest he resumed his medical practice on the frontier, where oversight was weaker and questions were fewer. There are hints, scattered and incomplete, that similar births occurred there as well. But documentation is scarce. Levine died without facing judgment, and much of his written work was deliberately destroyed by those who found it too disturbing to preserve. Knowledge, they decided, was dangerous when stripped of morality. What endured instead were the people. The descendants of those children still exist, sometimes unaware of why a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child appears unexpectedly in a family line marked by African ancestry. Genetics carried the truth forward even when memory failed. The past, though buried, continued to surface in quiet, undeniable ways. This was the final injustice of all. The system that enabled the harm outlived its own exposure. It denied personhood, denied justice, and then denied memory. The crime was not only what one man did, but what an entire structure allowed him to do without consequence. The women were denied voices, the children were denied belonging, and the truth was denied acknowledgement. What remained was a lesson written not in law books, but in lives. A reminder that when a society decides some people are less than human, it creates conditions where cruelty can exist without shame, and where evil does not need to hide. It only needs permission. As the years passed, the story that had once terrified plantation society faded from public memory, but it never truly disappeared. It survived quietly, passed down in fragments through families, altered by time but never erased. People spoke in half-truths and warnings rather than full explanations. Children were told not to ask certain questions, not to look too closely at certain faces, not to dig too deeply into the past. Silence became a form of inheritance. What had once been actively suppressed was now passively avoided, and avoidance proved just as effective in keeping the truth buried. In academic circles, slavery was increasingly discussed as an economic system, a political failure, or a moral contradiction, but rarely as a lived reality shaped by individual acts of violence hidden behind legality. The journals Vincent Habert left behind remained untouched for decades, their pages slowly aging in storage. When they were finally rediscovered by historians, they were treated cautiously, even skeptically. Some questioned their accuracy, others feared the implications of accepting them fully. The idea that such acts could occur openly, repeatedly, and without consequence challenged comforting narratives about gradual progress and moral awakening. It was easier to frame slavery as cruel in general than to confront its precise and deliberate horrors. The children at the center of the story had no such luxury. Their lives unfolded without the protection of abstraction. They faced rejection not because of something they had done, but because of what they represented. To white society, they were proof of hypocrisy. To black communities, they were reminders of violation and loss. Many spent their lives trying to outrun a past they never chose. Some changed names, some moved constantly, some buried themselves in work, hoping usefulness might replace belonging. But the questions followed them everywhere, lingering in stares and silences. What made their suffering especially cruel was its invisibility. There were no court records to validate it, no convictions to confirm it, no official acknowledgement that anything wrong had occurred. Without recognition, pain remained private, and without language, trauma turned inward. Generations later, descendants would still sense something unresolved, a tension they could not name. Family trees carried gaps. Stories ended abruptly. Certain ancestors were never discussed. The absence itself became a presence. This was not an accident of history. It was the result of deliberate choices made again and again to protect power over people. The system that enabled Levine's actions did not collapse because of them. It absorbed them. It treated them as acceptable losses, as unfortunate but necessary consequences of maintaining order. That same logic would appear later in different forms, justified with new language but driven by the same belief that some lives mattered less than others. The danger of such a system is not only the harm it allows, but the lessons it teaches. It trains people to accept cruelty when it is orderly, to excuse violence when it is profitable, and to ignore suffering when it is inconvenient. It teaches silence as wisdom and obedience as virtue. And once those lessons are learned, they do not disappear easily. They reshape societies long after the laws that created them are gone. What remains then is responsibility, not just to remember, but to confront. To understand that history is not distant or abstract, but personal and ongoing. The story does not end with Levine's disappearance or slavery's abolition. It continues in how societies choose to tell their pasts, whose pain they validate and whose they minimize. The greatest failure was not that these acts occurred, but that they were allowed to fade without reckoning. And until that reckoning exists, the silence itself becomes part of the crime. In the end, there was no single moment when the story truly stopped. It did not conclude with a trial, a confession before the public, or a dramatic reckoning that restored balance. Instead, it ended the way many injustices do, quietly, unevenly, and without satisfaction. Time moved forward, laws changed, and societies reshaped themselves, but the harm remained embedded in lives already lived. The women who had been violated carried their experiences to their graves, never having heard their suffering named as a wrong. The children grew old, some surrounded by families they built, others alone, all shaped by origins they did not choose. Their existence was the final evidence of what had happened, proof that no amount of silence could fully erase the past. What history recorded was incomplete. Ledgers stayed clean, official documents remained neutral, the absence of scandal was mistaken for the absence of crime. Yet truth does not require recognition to exist. It waits, patient and persistent, surfacing in unexpected ways. It appeared in family resemblances that made no sense, in questions children asked that parents could not answer, in feelings of displacement that had no clear cause. Even when names were forgotten, even when stories were softened or lost, the consequences endured. This is what makes the story difficult to accept. It does not offer comfort. It does not divide the world neatly into villains punished and victims saved. Instead, it forces a confrontation with how systems operate when power is unequal and accountability is optional. Dr. Levine was not an anomaly created by a broken system. He was the result of a functioning one. He acted with confidence because the law stood behind him. Others remained silent because silence was rewarded. Harm did not occur despite the structure of society, but because of it. The most unsettling truth is that nothing about this story is confined to its time. The language changes, the justifications evolve, but the pattern remains recognizable wherever people are reduced to objects, wherever authority is protected from scrutiny, wherever suffering is dismissed as inevitable. History repeats itself not because people forget dates and names, but because they accept the conditions that allow such acts to happen again. To tell this story fully is not to seek outrage alone, but understanding. It is to recognize that progress without honesty is fragile, and that forgetting is not the same as healing. The past does not demand guilt from those who did not create it, but it does demand responsibility from those who inherit its consequences. Responsibility to listen, to name harm accurately, and to refuse comfort built on denial. The final truth is simple and uncomfortable. What happened could have been stopped. It was not stopped because stopping it would have required valuing lives that the system had already decided were expendable. That decision, more than any single action, is what defines the real crime. And until societies are willing to confront that choice wherever it appears, the story does not truly end. It only waits, ready to be repeated or finally understood.